Well, welcome everyone to our 16th public forum. I'm Marilyn Mulvihill from St. Brendan's Church, and I'm happy to be here tonight, and I welcome all of you. Our forums are hosted by St. Brendan's, by the UU of the North Hills and Trinity Lutheran, and we try to educate on social justice issues. We do them because we believe Jesus cares about these issues, and we believe that Jesus calls us to care about them as well. Does anybody remember where you were and what you were doing on December 14th, 2012? I will never forget. That was the day that changed my life. On that day, a mentally ill young man walked into Sandy Hook Elementary School armed with several assault rifles and massacred 26 people, 20 of them first graders. I had taught first grade, and that incident shook me, as you can tell, it still does, shook me to the core. And from that day, I have done everything that I can do to reduce gun violence and to advocate for sensible gun laws. There's so many sensible things that we can do. And tonight we're going to discuss some of them. My hope is that you will be as passionate about reducing gun violence as I am, and that there will never, and we will all work together so that there will never, ever be another Sandy Hook massacre. So tonight, we're going to have a presentation for 30 minutes, and it'll be followed by question and answers. You can submit your questions to me via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And the presentation tonight, our presenter is Josh Fleetman. He is the Western Pennsylvania manager for Ceasefire PA. Ceasefire PA is the only Pennsylvania-based gun violence prevention organization. And their mission is to end the epidemic of gun violence by organizing the communities closest to the issue, educating the public, holding those in power accountable, and maximizing the strengths of every member in its broad coalition. Will you please welcome Josh Fleetman?
Thank you so much, Marilyn.
Sure.
Good evening, everyone. Very nice to be with you. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to share my screen and have a brief presentation for you all, and then happy to answer questions. Can you all see my cover slide here?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So once again, my name is Josh Fleetman. I'm the Western Pennsylvania manager with Ceasefire PA. Tonight we will understand the problem of gun violence. It's actually a complicated phenomenon. It's not quite as simple as some people may think when they think of one type of gun violence. There's a lot of different types of gun violence. So we'll go over the problem, which is important to understand, but that's all really gearing towards solutions. And so we'll talk about, as Marilyn mentioned, the plethora of policy solutions that are available to prevent gun violence. And then we'll talk about how you all can get involved in making your voice heard and getting involved in being a part of that change and being a part of making those solutions a reality. And then certainly plenty of time for question and answer as well. So just starting to kind of zoom out here, in the year 2020, 1,752 Pennsylvanians lost their lives to gun violence. This is the highest number we've seen in history of this state. 2020 was a terrible, terrible year for gun violence with the pandemic setting in at the beginning there. Unfortunately, the numbers have remained quite high. We don't have the final figures for 2021 yet. They're still being tabulated by the CDC. But with 2022, you know, as you've probably read in the news here, we've had a number of really terrible homicides just in the city of Pittsburgh over the past couple of weeks. And as you'll hear, gun violence is even more than just those homicides. But this just gives you a scope, an understanding of the scope of the human impact. You know, it's so easy to see, you know, to turn this debate and turn this conversation into numbers. But each one of these 1,752 people, it's a soul, a human. It's with someone with a family, with dreams and aspirations, and this really is a moral tragedy and a moral crisis, which is why I'm so glad to be speaking to people of faith, because this is a moral issue. Again, keeping a kind of high profile, zoomed out look at the issue here. This is kind of a heat map of gun violence in Pennsylvania. The darker the color, the more gun deaths per capita in that county. You probably won't be surprised to see in the southeast corner of the state, Philadelphia, shining bright red. Unfortunately, they have had even much worse than Pittsburgh, actually, horrible violence over the past couple of years, absolutely shattering their annual homicide records. Pittsburgh, as you see in Allegheny County, sadly, we're typically average, which is sad given how much violence we have here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. You'll also notice some interesting trends here, some rural areas, Elk County and Schuylkill County, among others, are very dark red. And you may be wondering why that is. They don't have big cities with high rates of gun violence. It's actually firearm suicide, which is disproportionately impacting rural areas, as we'll go into more detail. And so this is really to underscore the fact that gun violence is as diverse as the state itself, and there is no corner of our Commonwealth that is untouched by this epidemic. It can be easy for especially people who oppose gun violence prevention to dismiss it as that's a city problem, that's an urban issue. As we'll see here, it's not. It is in every county, every part of our Commonwealth experiences gun violence. So I mentioned there's lots of different types of gun violence. Firearm suicides actually account for the majority of gun deaths. Typically, they're about 2/3 of gun deaths in any given year. A lot of people don't realize that. So when we're talking about gun violence prevention, we have to talk about firearm suicide prevention as well. There's, of course, community level violence, which is the types of homicides we've been seeing in Pittsburgh over the past couple of weeks, in Philadelphia, in other predominantly urban areas, and predominantly Black and brown communities face the brunt of this. Domestic violence is everywhere in our state, but for suburban areas that may not experience community violence, domestic violence is one that they experience, and we'll talk about the very specific connection between firearms and domestic violence. Obviously, mass shootings. That is probably when people think about gun violence, just like Maryland, and that's how I got into this movement as well after Sandy Hook. When you think about gun violence, you most commonly think about the kind of horrible mass shootings. They are certainly terrible. They actually are a small number of gun deaths, which we'll go into. So there's important context there. Unintentional shootings as well. We have some of those. We have a lot of those every single year, and some just recently in Pittsburgh, often where a young child will find a firearm in the home and not properly secured by the parents or by an adult, and will unintentionally shoot themselves or somebody else. And then finally, police shootings. This is definitely a form of gun violence. When police are killing others with guns, that is gun violence. And it's a particularly kind of pernicious form of gun violence because it has a negative feedback where if the community is afraid of calling the police, the people who are tasked with protecting them, public safety is not going to get better measurably. So that is certainly a form of gun violence. Police violence is gun violence. I want to be very clear about that. I'll primarily focus on firearm suicide, community violence, and mass shootings tonight. I'll touch on domestic violence as well. Unintentional and police shootings are kind of a whole other conversation that we don't have time for tonight, unfortunately. But always happy to come back and talk more if that is something you'd all like. So again, these are the numbers from 2020. Of those 1,752 people that died by gun violence, actually in 2020 it was closer to half of the gun deaths were suicides, as opposed to normally 2/3, because the number of homicides spiked so highly in the year 2020. So you'll see homicides account for about 45% of gun deaths in Pennsylvania in the year 2020. Law enforcement shootings by police is about 1%, mass shootings about another percent. And then that third sliver is a percentage where the data, we actually do not know what type of gun violence it was. And that speaks to the problems we have with data collection, oftentimes very intentional problems by elected officials who, I would argue, don't want to know the problem of gun violence, so they don't feel the need to do something about it. And so there's not very good data collection on the issue of gun violence, and that leads to 1% of shootings we don't even know how to categorize them, unfortunately. So starting with firearm suicide, and let me say before I dive in here, this issue obviously is inherently traumatic, talking about gun violence. And I certainly do not want to traumatize anybody further who has experienced gun violence or has a visceral response to this. So if at any point you feel like you need to take a break, please feel comfortable to do so. This is all about your comfort level. I want to start off talking about firearm suicide, which, as I mentioned, drives the majority of gun deaths in Pennsylvania. This young man here, his name was Hans, 18-year-old high school senior, had his whole life ahead of him. Very bright young man, popular, good grades, going to college. And like a lot of young people, he experienced a moment of crisis. He fell into a depression and anxiety, and he was able to go buy a gun. And because there's no waiting periods and there's nothing to stop him from buying a gun, he was able to take his life the very same day, hours after he bought that gun with the firearm. And it's a horrible tragedy to the family to this day. Obviously, it's still devastated. The entire community is. This is just, and I always want to put a human face, as difficult as it is, to put a human face to these numbers and these stories, because this is a life, this is a soul, and been extinguished because of easy access to firearms. And I tell that story because there's a very direct connection between firearms and suicides. Firearms are actually, they only account for about 5% of suicide deaths, 5% of suicide attempts, but they account for over half of the actual suicide deaths. And that shows how disproportionately lethal the firearm is as a mechanism of committing self-harm. One can imagine other types of suicide attempts, they are much less lethal. About 40% of those other methods to commit suicide, 40% are fatal, whereas 9 out of 10 attempts with a firearm are fatal. And so this really speaks to, as I'll get to down the road in this presentation, if you can, obviously you want to prevent people from trying to commit suicide in the first place, but if you can, at a minimum, remove that most lethal means, they have a much, much higher chance of surviving any suicide attempts. And when you look at who is most impacted by suicide, I touched on this, different from other types of gun violence, it's actually white rural men are most at risk of firearm suicide death in Pennsylvania. 93% of the victims were white people in Pennsylvania. Actually, white rural men age 50 and above are the demographic most at risk, which is obviously horrible, but it actually, in a very practical kind of sense, does lead to kind of political opportunity to convince the lawmakers from more rural areas who may be in other ways hostile to action on gun safety, really underscoring the point that gun violence is an issue in your community, in your rural community. Suicide with a firearm is a major driver. We saw 900 Pennsylvanians die by suicide in the year 2020. And this is the through line throughout the whole presentation, but having a gun in the home puts you at a much higher risk of firearm suicide. You're at a 3 times greater risk if you have a gun in the home of fatally completing a suicide. And the unique thing about suicide and suicidal ideation is that there's a couple unique things about it. One is that most of the time, in 80% of the cases, there's a warning sign. Somebody has said something to a loved one. Somebody notices something that clues them off to this person may be considering suicide. So that creates a further opportunity to intervene and to save somebody. The other major important point to know is, like in the story of Hans, it's often a very impulsive, quick decision. The majority of survivors of suicide will say that they attempted suicide within 24 hours of first having the thought. And so if you have that lethal means around, you're much higher risk of trying to attempt it with that lethal means. Whereas if you can put time and space between yourself and that lethal means, you're much more likely to rethink your decision, or if you do attempt it, to not have as lethal an outcome. Community violence, homicide, is the second biggest category of gun violence. In Pennsylvania, about 50% as well of the gun deaths. And these are obviously very different from firearm suicides in that they disproportionately affect the Black and brown community. Here in Allegheny County, It's the Black community that's most impacted. Allegheny County, 13% of the population here is Black, but it was 80% of firearm homicide victims are Black in Allegheny County in the year 2020, which just is an incredible disparity. And that is backed up by this, kind of larger picture figure here. In Pennsylvania, you're 21 times more likely to be murdered by a gun if you are Black than if you are white. And that is due to a whole host of obviously societal injustices and systemic racism and poverty, and as we'll talk about, trauma actually, which is a big part of this conversation. Again, firearms increase the danger of being a victim of homicide. It is most closely seen in domestic violence, but same with community level violence. And there's again a very clear connection. Homicides, 80% of all homicides are completed using a firearm. And so you may sometimes hear people, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, they're doing it with guns. It's just an undeniable fact that firearms are the major driver of homicides. I also want to make an important point that, up until now I've talked about fatalities and deaths. And, there's once again, 1,752 firearm deaths in the year 2020. That same year, there were 3,000 people non-fatally injured by firearms. And that is a staggering number in and of itself that has another whole host of costs to it. Obviously, the physical cost of recovering from an injury that can be extremely severe, sometimes with lifelong disabilities and paralysis, and obviously the mental and emotional costs of that trauma, having undergone that kind of attack. This is why gun violence costs Pennsylvania $12 billion, billion with a B, every single year. And I hate to put a dollar figure on it. These are human lives, but when you're talking to policymakers, sometimes that helps quantify the issue. This is a massive economic cost. People not being able to go to work, not being able to care for their kids, taxing the public safety system, the medical system, social services system, all because of the impacts of gun violence. And as I pointed out with survivors, it's not just the physical damage, it is, and not even just survivors, people who are adjacent to gun violence. Even if you are in a community where gun violence happens, there's been recent studies that show, especially with young kids, you are much more likely to visit an emergency room for mental health if you've been exposed to gun violence in your neighborhood. You're also much more likely to perform more poorly academically speaking, which is a very pernicious kind of social impact, because people who are most at risk of being exposed to gun violence are already disadvantaged. If you're then impacting your mental health and your academic performance, it's putting you at a further disadvantage societally speaking. So that's an example of how the damage of gun violence already disproportionately impacts the most disadvantaged among us and continually does so in a very vicious cycle. The third major category of gun violence is mass shootings. And obviously we here in Pittsburgh know the sting of this all too well. Just in 2018, at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill, we lost so many people to a madman with a weapon of war. A couple important things to note about mass shootings, as I mentioned at the top. Compared to gun suicides and homicides, they are actually quite rare. They represent a very small percentage of the actual gun deaths. Of course, that being said, they are deeply traumatic for the entire community, for the country, for everyone involved. And that's why they receive disproportionate media attention, understandably, because they are such horrific spectacles, and the media can't help but cover it, and they should. But I also wish the media would do a better job of covering the day-to-day toll of gun violence from suicides and homicides, because those really are, looking at the raw numbers, driving much more of the violence. Important point to note about mass shootings also is that the weapon of choice for them is very clear. It's military-style assault rifles, oftentimes the AR-15 or M16 style rifles. And also point out later in the presentation, there's access to those in Pennsylvania that makes it easier to commit mass shootings. A couple final points on mass shootings. If you broaden the definition out to a mass shooting, you do see higher numbers. So when you think about mass shooting, you think about Tree of Life, Sandy Hook, Pulse nightclub, these kind of very intentional mass events. The Gun Violence Archive is a nonprofit organization dedicated to data collection and analysis on gun violence, partly because there's gaps in government data. We had to form a nonprofit to do a better job of collecting data. They define mass shootings as 4 or more people injured, not including the shooter. And if you use that definition, the number of mass shootings goes up to about 35 per year in Pennsylvania in the year 2021, which is about 1 every 10 days, which is a pretty staggering statistic, a mass shooting in Pennsylvania every 10 days. And that's one example comes to mind. In Philadelphia about a year ago, there was a shooting at a train station, and 6 or 7 people were hit just by virtue of being a very crowded urban area. Wasn't necessarily the intentional kind of mass shooting you think of when you think of Tree of Life, but it was categorized as a mass shooting because of the number of victims. Final category I'll talk about briefly is domestic violence. This is everywhere in Pennsylvania. No community goes without domestic violence. There's a very strong connection between firearms and domestic violence. If there's a gun in the home, you are 5 times more likely to be killed by your abuser than if there's not a gun in the home. And this issue is pervasive. 4.5 million Americans were threatened with a firearm by their loved one, by their intimate other. And so this is a very broad threat, especially with the number of guns and the gun sales surging since the pandemic started. I know it's all very, very depressing, so I'd like to end this section on a somewhat positive note as it relates to domestic violence. Actually, it's just in 2018 when Pennsylvania, the legislature passed Act 79, which was the first major piece of gun violence prevention legislation to be passed in Pennsylvania in 14 years at the time. And what that did was it disarmed domestic abusers. So this law, Act 79, now says in Pennsylvania, if you have a final PFA, a protection from abuse order on your record, you are barred from not just purchasing new firearms, you actually have to relinquish your existing firearms to law enforcement. And that is a big positive step in terms of protecting people who are abused by their significant others. I'll say that implementing this law is another story. Passing a law is one thing, implementing it is a different thing, especially in Pennsylvania, where we have such a fragmented public safety system. There's hundreds of police departments across the state. Some of them do a very good job of actually obtaining and relinquishing these firearms after this judge issues a PFA. Others do not do a very good job of relinquishing those firearms, and those communities are still at risk, and those families and those people are still at risk. So we are monitoring this implementation, working with the Domestic Violence Coalition and law enforcement across the state to develop best practices to actually better implement this law that is on the books in Pennsylvania. So again, I know that was all pretty depressing, but I think it is important to understand the nature of the problem if we're going to understand solutions, of which there are many. There are so many possible policy solutions that we can implement in Pennsylvania to save lives. We can compare state by state. That's the nature, that's the great thing about this country. We can compare state by state, the policy one state has versus others, and we can see study after study shows that states with stronger gun laws have less gun violence. It's a simple fact, and I want to make that clear. It is a scientific fact that strong gun laws save lives. So we at Ceasefire PA, we advocate for a number of these solutions. I'll talk about some of them tonight. Our common agenda to end gun violence is a legislative package that would address all the different types of gun violence I just talked about. Investing in safer communities is a non-legislative approach. It's about funding community-based violence prevention programs. And then there's some other solutions I'll briefly touch on as well if we have time. I know that we do want to keep time here. So usually this presentation, I've talked for about an hour, so I'm condensing a little bit for you all. And just to give you a little bit of context before I dive into more into the solutions here, I kind of put our solutions in 2 different buckets. One of them is access, so limiting access to firearms through strengthening our gun laws, which is most commonly what people think about when they think about gun violence prevention. But there's also a whole host of other policies that have been getting a lot more attention over the past couple of years that address the root causes of gun violence. And that's the way we invest in these community-based programs to address these root causes. So this is kind of a paradigm for you to think about how these different solutions fit into these 2 different kind of big buckets here. So the common agenda, this is the addressing the issue of access to firearms through legislation. It's 3 policies we put together. We assembled them with broad support, after we've talked to a number of our partners across the state people on the front lines of the gun violence crisis, what would most, help you do your job, what would most save lives. It's a coalition approach. So, we recognize that we cannot do this work on our own, nor should we. It's a matter of bringing as many diverse voices as possible together from all across the state to advocate. And so that's what the Common Agenda is all about. And it really does focus on community efforts, on amplifying the voices of people in their own communities where they can most have impact with their lawmakers, with their neighbors, with other members of their community. So the Common Agenda is 3 policies. And remember, the problem we're trying to address here is threefold: firearm suicide, firearm homicide at the community level, and mass shootings. So to address firearm suicide, we advocate for extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOs, ERPOs as the acronym. You may have heard these called red flag laws at sometimes. They are a way to temporarily restrict someone's access to a firearm when they're in a crisis. So if somebody is showing signs that they're suicidal, if they have posted on social media, they want to shoot up their high school or something, under this legislation, if this were to become law, a family member or a law enforcement officer could petition a judge to issue this ERPO. If a judge reviews the evidence, goes through a due process, determines that yes, this person is an imminent risk to themselves or others, the judge would issue that ERPO, which would mean the individual would not be able to buy a firearm, and they would also, similar to that Domestic Violence Act 79, they would have to relinquish their firearm. The important point to note here is that it's temporary. It's just for 1 year, and that's to give people, again, time and space between themselves and this most lethal means. We can see that these policies reduce suicide. I'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment, but lost and stolen gun reporting is a really important policy to prevent and reduce community level violence. And it's just as simple as it sounds. It's about reporting lost and stolen guns, which drive a lot of the illegal guns in our state, which drives a lot of the crime. And then finally, universal background checks as the third policy. You hear a lot about this at the federal level. It's also an issue here at the state level. And this is to close a gap in our state background check system that allows for the private sales of long guns, those weapons of war that are used in mass shootings most commonly. So lost and stolen gun reporting, a lot of people don't realize there's no legal duty to report when your gun is lost or stolen in Pennsylvania. I should think most responsible gun owners would do it. Some don't. And the problem is it's quite common. 21 guns go missing on average every single day in this state, all across the state, 21 guns, which is a lot. It adds up to quite a bit. These guns are very commonly used in crimes because they cannot be traced back to the individual who committed the crime. All they can be traced back to, if we have a background check, is the person who actually bought the gun. And so what we'll often see is, say for example, a gun that I bought legally ends up at a crime scene. Police recover the gun there. They can use the serial number to track the gun purchased back to me. They'll say, "Hey Josh, how did this gun that you bought end up at this crime scene?" Now, perhaps it was an honest mistake. Perhaps I really did lose the gun or something. I question the level of responsibility of somebody who loses a gun so easily, or who leaves a gun in their car glove box and it gets stolen, for example. That's not a responsible way to store your gun. But maybe it was an honest mistake, in which case I should have reported the gun to the police. What most often is the case, though, is that the person who bought that gun did not lose it in good faith. They are often a straw purchaser, which is somebody who buys a gun knowingly for somebody who cannot legally buy a gun themselves. It's a way to get around the background check process. Straw purchasing is illegal already in Pennsylvania, but the problem is it's hard to enforce that law. It's hard to track those people down. It's hard to notice when it's happening. And so if police ask me, "Hey Josh, how did this gun end up at this crime scene?" and I'm a straw purchaser, I'm obviously not going to admit I'm a straw purchaser because it's against the law. So what I'll say is, "Oh, the gun was lost, the gun was stolen." And it's a consequence-free excuse because I've not broken any law by not reporting that gun. So it creates a very easy way to evade straw purchasing laws, and it makes it harder to hold straw purchasing and gun traffickers accountable. So a simple law that says within 3 days of noticing when your gun is missing, you've got to report it to police. And if you don't, it's a summary offense or a misdemeanor, but really it's a way to better hold gun traffickers accountable. And it works. We know that states that have this kind of law, they see on average a 46% lower number of illegal guns being trafficked in their state. And those illegal guns are what is driving so many of the community level homicides. And I'll say, I've spoken to a number of Republican lawmakers who support this legislation. Privately, they'll tell me this makes a lot of sense. It's just a matter of them feeling like they need public backing and they can come out and publicly support this. And we are making progress on that. And I've got some ways to do that toward the end of this presentation. But there is, I've had some very productive conversations with elected officials who you may think are hostile to gun safety. Even this kind of policy makes a lot of sense. And really, I'll say all these policies make a lot of sense, but this one especially. Extreme risk protection orders, I talked about this. These are a way to temporarily remove someone's access to guns when they're suicidal or homicidal. 19 states and DC have this law on the books, and it's been shown to be very effective. Indiana, which is one of the first states to pass this law, and yes, Indiana, you know, a very conservative state in this country, they have this law on the books, and it's led to a 15% reduction in firearm suicides. So this is a really simple way to respect people's ability to responsibly own a gun, while also acknowledging that, you know, you don't have to be quote unquote crazy. It's not a very, I don't like that word. Anybody can fall into a crisis. Anybody can become depressed or anxious or suicidal. And the benefit of this ERPO process is that it's so flexible. It lasts for 1 year. And even in the space of that 1 year, if you overcome your crisis, you know, you lost your job and you got a new job, or your girlfriend got back together with you, so whatever it was that was causing you to be suicidal, you can then go back to the judge early before that year is up and say, look, I'm doing a lot better. I'd like to have my firearm access restored. And if a judge agrees with you, he can terminate the ERPO early. The flip side of that is, if after a year you still are in a state of crisis, the ERPO can be renewed for another year to help make sure that you don't have access to that most lethal means. And the final part of our common agenda is background checks. So Pennsylvania, we run our own state-based background check system, which is much better than the national background check system for many reasons. But it has one big gap, and that is the private sale of long guns. So if you're buying an AR-15, a shotgun, if you're buying that gun from a licensed dealer, like a gun store or somebody who makes their living off selling guns, you actually do have to get a background check if you're buying that gun from a licensed dealer. But if you're buying that very same type of gun from a private seller, no background check needed. So you can, somebody in the parking lot of a gun show, Uncle Jim's friend Bob or something, you can get these, again, weapons of war that are most commonly used in mass shootings with no vetting, no background check whatsoever. So we want to close that gap with simple legislation that says any gun sale needs a background check, every gun sale, every time for a background check. And that prevents people with these kinds of issues here. If you have a felony conviction on your record, if you have been involuntarily committed to a mental health facility, for example, you will be flagged in a background check and prevented from buying a gun. So that was the legislative part of our advocacy, the legislation that addresses access to firearms. The final part here is the addressing the root causes of gun violence. We call this campaign Invest in Safer Communities, and it's all about getting funding to programs that do violence prevention work. I'll talk about some of these programs and how they work. Broadly speaking, there's a lot of evidence of social science research that shows that programs like this can be very effective at reducing violence. The problem is they suffer from a lack of funding or inconsistent funding, which makes it very difficult for these programs to scale up, to act sustainably. And if you get a grant 1 year, you hire a bunch of workers to do outreach in the community, then you don't get a grant the next year, you've got to lay all those workers off. What have you really accomplished? It takes a lot of time to address some of these root causes of gun violence. So we are advocating for $80 million in the state budget. The state budget is being crafted right now in Harrisburg, going to be passed in late June. And we want to see $80 million going toward grants to support organizations that do this work. To be clear, that's not money coming to Ceasefire. We are not an organization that does on the ground violence prevention work. We see a role as being advocates for those organizations, as helping bring them together in a coalition, as helping provide some policy expertise. So this is money for community-based groups that do violence prevention. There's three core components of any successful violence prevention program. One is that it has to be focused on high-risk individuals. In any given city, and Pittsburgh is no exception, it's about 1 to 3% of the population that is actually actively involved in gun violence. And so programs that target those people with services and with interventions, that is most effective as opposed to kind of something broad in the whole community, in the whole city. And so you target those individuals with access to services and supports. So a lot of what drives gun violence is poverty, is lack of access to opportunity, lack of hope. And so services like housing support, like job training and counseling, like mental health and behavioral counseling, drug and alcohol rehabilitation, things like that can help somebody negate the parts of their life that make them more at risk of becoming involved in gun violence. That's a key part of these interventions. And the third and final part I mentioned a little earlier is a trauma-informed approach. Certainly, economic drivers like poverty drive a lot of gun violence, but actually trauma is now a major driver of gun violence itself. There's an old saying that hurt people hurt people. If you have been hurt and traumatized, you're then much more likely to go on and hurt and traumatize somebody else. And that is true with gun violence as well. We see a lot of the perpetrators of gun violence are themselves victims of gun violence. And so it's a horrible cycle of violence and trauma in underprivileged neighborhoods that have been disinvested in, obviously through systemic racism. And so we need trauma-informed approaches to break that cycle of trauma and prevent hurt people from hurting other people. So those are kind of three basic criteria for successful programs. And here's some examples of programs that implement those criteria. In the top left is a program in Philadelphia that is actually really unique. It brings kids into Temple University Hospital where they see hundreds of gunshot wounds every single year. This program is run by a trauma surgeon who was sick and tired of pulling bullets out of people, especially young kids increasingly. So it brings kids into the hospital. It shows them, oftentimes very graphically, what the actual gun wound looks like and what a surgery to remove a bullet looks like and how devastating that can be. It walks you through the process. It comes as close as you possibly can to helping a young person experience gun violence without actually them being shot. Obviously, we don't want to do that. And so this has been a very effective program at helping young people who are most at risk of being involved in gun violence to really take extremely seriously the risk. I think we see guns glamorized in the media, and that makes the cost of gun violence seem like a fantasy almost, or not tangible, not real. So this makes it real. This is not exactly a scared straight kind of approach, but it's just trying to help people understand and see viscerally the cost of gun violence. In the top right is a program run by the Delaware County District Attorney out in Eastern Pennsylvania. This program, unlike the others, is actually a partnership between law enforcement and the community. Many of these programs are explicitly non-law enforcement based. This one actually is, and Pittsburgh has a similar program in the city of Pittsburgh called Group Violence Intervention. This is kind of a carrot and stick approach. So police, they largely know who that 1% of the population is that's most at risk of gun violence. And so they, law enforcement is very clear. They reach out to these people and say, hey, look, we know who you are. We know you are involved in some shady stuff and that you may be involved in gun violence. We're watching you, and if you commit a crime, we will hold you accountable. That's the stick. The carrot is, but if you'd like to, come out of this lifestyle, if you want an off-ramp and to a more productive, stable, safe life, here's this whole host of community resources. Again, housing, job training, mental health, drug and alcohol treatment, childcare, all kinds of services that can help people get off of that path of where they're at risk of being involved in gun violence. And this program, specifically in the city of Chester, which is a In Delaware County, which is largely a suburban county with low rates of homicide, but Chester is an urban pocket of that county. It has very high rates of gun violence. This program has been quite successful. It's cut shootings 40% in the past year through this kind of intervention. In the bottom left is a program called Ready. They were started in Chicago. They're coming to Philadelphia. Really, really powerful program that is a workforce development-based program. So it literally gives people job skills. It gives them a monthly stipend while they're in job training, so they have a stable source of income. And critically, it pairs that with cognitive behavioral therapy to address those root causes of trauma, to help people gain stronger conflict resolution skills, which really is what we see a lot of these shootings, people who just don't know how to psychologically deal with the trauma and the anger and the emotion, and they take it out in a moment, in an instant, by shooting a gun. This program has been very effective, and it's coming to Pennsylvania. I hope it comes to Pittsburgh in addition to Philly, because it's a very strong program. As a final example, here in the bottom right, we do have a program in Pittsburgh, the Greater Pittsburgh Mad Dads. They are a direct kind of street outreach program. So these are primarily, older African-American men who, some of them maybe themselves have been involved in gun violence in the past, and so they're what we call credible messengers. They are people who can be taken seriously and engage with, and let's just be honest, primarily with Black youth in Allegheny County who are most at risk of being involved in gun violence. They're credible with them. So they do neighborhood patrols, they do community events, they do mentoring, helping young people steer clear of a life where they can become involved in gun violence. So these are just 4 examples. There's a whole host of programs. There's really no limit to the type of program you can run, as long as it has, in our view, those 3 core criteria: that it focuses on high-risk individuals, that it provides support services, and then it has a trauma-informed approach. So these programs work. Oops, excuse me. Again, they suffer from a lack of funding, and so last year we were successful, Ceasefire PA, in bringing together a statewide coalition that advocated and successfully got $30 million in the state budget, as well as $20 million in the city of Philadelphia budget for grants that go to this kind of programming. This year, the governor has proposed $30 million in his own budget. It's a start, and we love the governor for what he's doing, but we think we need more, so we're calling for $80 million in the state budget. And actually here in Allegheny County, the county government is getting involved. They've put out a request for proposals for local groups to get funded for grants to do this kind of work. We're very encouraged about that, funding at the local level as well. Really, we need all the funding we can get at all levels of government. Even corporate donors need to step up. So if we can, our calculations show if we can get about $300 million in funding over the next 5 years for these kinds of programs, we can cut shootings by 30%, we estimate, in Pennsylvania. And so this is a really tangible way to save lives. And politically speaking, it's a much later lift, because it's not viewed as gun control. It's not about taking away guns, which of course we don't want to do. That's a talking point from the other side. But this is simply about investing in evidence-based programs. And so again, we've had a lot of conversations with some rock-ribbed conservative legislators who otherwise would not even take a meeting with Ceasefire PA, and talking about these kinds of programs, and they're very interested because they can save lives while still totally respecting responsible gun ownership. It just needs investment from the government. Briefly, I'll just talk about some other solutions that you not heard me mention tonight, but we do support all of these. Safe storage, very important to prevent unintentional shootings. As I mentioned at the beginning, when often a young child finds a gun not safely secured, this legislation would say when you're not using the gun, it's got to be safely stored, locked up in a safe, or with a trigger lock on it. Ideally, with the ammunition locked up and stored separately is really the safest way to store it. Assault weapons ban, that you've heard about that at the national level quite a bit. There was a federal assault weapons ban from 1994 to 2004. And when that expired automatically, we have seen a significant jump in deaths by assault weapons after that ban expired, including the Tree of Life, obviously. There's also a state level version of that bill that would ban assault weapons here in Pennsylvania. I'll be totally candid with you that legislation is very unlikely to pass in the current political landscape. That's why we focus on the common agenda. because those are just so gosh darn reasonable. And even if you poll gun owners, poll conservative voters, they still support a lot of the common agenda bills very highly, 70-80% of the population. Whereas assault weapons ban is a lot more controversial. We still support it, certainly, but it's just not as politically feasible. So our strategy is start with the low-hanging fruit, get the more popular bills passed, show how they can reduce gun violence, show how the sky does not fall. Second Amendment still exists when we pass gun safety bills, and then move on to some of the more impactful, bigger legislation like assault weapons bans. And like permit to purchase, that's the final one I want to mention. That's kind of the gold standard of gun violence prevention policies. And it's just what it sounds like. You would need a permit to purchase a firearm in Pennsylvania if this were to become law. Interesting kind of data comparison here. Connecticut passed a permit to purchase law, and they saw their rate of gun violence go down quite a bit. Missouri had a permit to purchase law on the books. They repealed it, and they saw their gun violence rates skyrocket. And so that just goes to show how this particular policy can be very impactful. Again, I would categorize this as not politically feasible right now, but I think the more we can build this movement and show that gun safety laws save lives and build support, we can move toward this in Pennsylvania. Okay, so the final thing I want to talk to you all about, we've talked about the problem, we've talked about the solutions, and so now I want to talk to you about how you can get involved, because as much as I will sit here and Zoom with hundreds of people for the rest of my life and talk to them right in the face, I wish I could, but I cannot make this change by myself. I need the help of citizens like you. That is who legislators are listening to. You have so much power as citizens. Do not underestimate that. I used to work in legislative offices. I used to work for a state senator, was on Capitol Hill for a while. And I can tell you that, constituent calls, constituent emails and letters, they get read, they get listened to, they get discussed, they drive sometimes decision-making by elected officials. And so please, make those calls to lawmakers, sign up for our emails and click that button to send an email to your lawmaker. They make a difference. I want to provide one big opportunity here. Ceasefire PA, we are actually going to Harrisburg to lobby lawmakers directly for these policies, to have a big rally on the front steps of the Capitol building. It's going to be April 26th. I will drop a link in the chat in a moment where you can register to sign up to join us. We'd love to have you. We're going to have a bus coming from Pittsburgh to Harrisburg and back for free. We will provide lunch. We'll provide a Zoom training to give you a better sense of how to lobby a legislator, how to be prepared to meet with your lawmakers. I know you're all in the North Hills, and there's plenty of state representatives in the North Hills that have a lot of work to do when it comes to being better on this issue, and they need to hear from you as constituents. So I'll send a link out in the chat, and hopefully we can get an email out to you as well with the link to register for Advocacy Day. If you cannot join us, we are going to have a postcard project as a follow-up where you can, through an organized way, send a postcard to your lawmakers to urge them to take action. Outside of that, you always please feel free as constituents of these lawmakers, their job is to represent you, to pick up the phone, give their office a call, send them an email. Again, those do make big differences. And the final thing I'll mention is, I've spent the whole evening here talking about gun violence as a policy issue, as a informed issue, which it is. But ultimately, it's become a cultural issue in this country. And the only way to change a culture is to have face-to-face human conversations with people you know and love. So I encourage you all to take what you've learned tonight and talk to your family, your friends, your neighbors. Have honest, vulnerable conversations. They don't have to be screaming matches. You can sometimes agree to disagree. But I think if you actually drill down and have vulnerable conversations with folks, you'll find there's actually a lot more agreement than disagreement, especially as it relates to suicide. So many families have felt suicide by firearm, and there's so much common ground there to take action and to make real policy change that can save lives. So I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for your time. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but thank you all so much.
Josh, thank you. Thank you very much. We learned an awful lot. It's great to learn things, but it's not, what you know that matters. It's what you do with what you know that matters. So if you had to pick one thing that we should do because of what we've learned tonight, what would that one thing to do be?
Well, I'd love for you to come to Advocacy Day. I recognize that's a little bit of a big ask to come to Harrisburg. So the second one, start small. I'll also put in the chat a petition you can sign to, it'll send a petition to the leaders in Harrisburg, because that's one of the big problems. I'll stop sharing my screen here. A lot of legislators individually and their constituents support these bills. I think if they actually got to a vote on the floor, they would pass. The problem is these bills cannot even get to a vote, let alone a discussion in committee. And so this petition, I'll drop a link in the chat in a moment. It's a petition to Speaker of the House, Brian Cutler, and President of the State Senate, Jake Corman, asking them to do their job, to break up this logjam, to actually force discussion and vote on these bills, because that's what we need to do, is we need to actually force a conversation. Because I think if there was a conversation and there was a vote, we'd see these bills actually pass.
That's great. Yeah. Well, we look forward to that petition on the chat. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? Anybody else have anything they'd like to ask Josh? I didn't see anything in the chat. I'm going to check one more time. Okay. There's the link for Advocacy Day, and I don't see any other questions. Josh, you did such a fantastic and thorough presentation. I guess there's no questions, but I want to thank you. I want to thank Julie.
I do see one. I'm sorry, from Virginia.
Okay, what is the question?
It was in the Q&A box. How can these excellent programs you described compete with what our young people see as glorification of violence through gangs, media, etc. in this country? It's a good question. I'll start off by saying people talk a lot about kind of gun violence in video games and in rap videos. I think I'm not going to say those have no impact on gun violence, but there have been studies that have been done, and the link is actually not quite that clear. So in terms of that aspect of it, I don't know if it's that huge a driver. I think what we actually often see is young kids picking up guns because they themselves are afraid of other young kids with guns. And it's a really kind of terrible cycle where they don't want to have a gun. They don't want to feel the need to do that, but they just do feel the need because they feel the neighborhood, their school is so unsafe. And so that's an example of kind of just a negative feedback cycle that drives a lot of gun violence. But to Virginia's question, about the glorification of violence and how these programs, the community-based programs, can address that, I think it gives them a sense of self-worth outside of kind of a macho culture. And I think that is what does drive some young men, especially, to want to carry a gun so they can feel big and strong, because they have trauma that has not been dealt with. And so that's how they cope with the trauma, is by trying to feel bigger and stronger than others by carrying a gun. And so that trauma-informed approach, I think, is really key to addressing that kind of psychological state that leads to youth gun violence specifically.
Great. Thanks, Virginia. Thanks, Josh. Anybody else? One last time. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, St. Brendan's Church and the Justice Ministry. Thank you, Unitarian Universalist of the North Hills and Trinity Lutheran. And thank you, everyone. Like I said, you've learned a lot. What are you going to do with what you learned? Please do something. And God bless you all. Oh, one last thing. There'll be another forum. I almost forgot, Donna, sorry. There'll be another forum in May. We don't have the topic or the date quite yet, but watch your email and social media for that one that will be led by Trinity Lutheran. So again, thank you all for tonight, and we appreciate all of you being here. It's an important issue, and thanks for your participation. Good night,
everyone.